Well, joining me now to discuss this is Executive Director at the National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., Jamil Jaffer. Jamil, good evening to you. Is this an escalation? What is happening? Why are these 700 Marines going to LA?
Well, I think part of the reason here is that the president thinks that the Los Angeles, that the state, the city needs more support, that they're not able to currently control the situation. So he's deploying the forces he has. Now, I think in an ideal world, the president, if he was going to deploy more forces, would deploy the National Guard. But they're not prepared right now. And so he's made the decision to add 700 Marines to Task Force 51, which is the group of military folks that are there deployed to the streets of LA, alongside, I would mention, not just the LAPD, but a large swath of federal agents and law enforcement from CBP, ICE, and the like. And so it's not just sort of classic LAPD law enforcement on the ground, but you've got now a variety of federal officers, including now, soon to be at least 700 Marines, including the National Guard.
I mean, I'm looking at images of LA now. There is absolutely no sign of trouble. The governor, Gavin Newsom, said that this is a deranged fantasy, that they are not required. In fact, he didn't okay the arrival of those 300 National Guard in the first place. LA was having Pride at the same time. 40 police officers were at Pride, and Gavin Newsom said, look, if we needed them, we would have pulled them to the protest, but we didn't need them. This is antagonistic.
Right. That's been made clear, I think, both by Governor Newsom as well as LA Mayor Karen Bass. Now, that being said, we obviously saw what happened on the streets of LA over the weekend. You saw a number of cars on fire, these Waymo cars that these protesters had stopped and had vandalized. So there's clearly something more going on than meets the eye, in the sense that if LAPD really had the situation under control, either alone or with the federal officers that were there, you might not have seen those things take place. And those things did take place. The president then, in what I think everyone agrees is an unprecedented move to deploy the National Guard without the request of a governor. The only time that's happened before, as I know you know, Petrie was in the scenario where on multiple occasions, American presidents have deployed the National Guard without state authority to enforce civil rights laws. To enforce desegregation orders by courts. And that's not what happened here.
No.
This is the first time that we know of that in a riot type scenario or a law and order type scenario where a governor hasn't requested support and the president's deployed the troops. Anyways, the president has the authority, to be clear. There's no question the president has the authority to do this, to federalize the National Guard and deploy them. But the circumstances
only under certain laws, right? And Gavin Newsom is saying that Title 10, which is the one that Donald Trump cited, is not relevant here, and that's why he's taking him to court for it. And the only time that Donald Trump really had the right to use the National Guard is during an insurrection, and there was one in Washington where he could have deployed the National Guard. It's the only area that he can do it without state governor approval, and he didn't do that.
No, that's exactly right. And that being said, though, the president has made a determination, right, pursuant to statute. He has statutory authority to take action in a scenario where he determines there's an insurrection. Now, that can be litigated down the road.
But he hasn't used the word insurrection on LA. He hasn't cited insurrection.
Right. Well, one of his advisors referred to it as insurrection, Stephen Miller, did refer to it that way. Now, we'll see what authority the president cites if and when he goes to court, right? But what we know now, as of now, at least, is the president has determined, under whatever authority he thinks he has, that he has the authority to do so. And now it'll be a question it'll be litigated, and we'll see what happens. But at the end of the day, it's sort of the real question of whether the president had the authority or not. It's happened. And so the question now becomes, what if anything needs to be done about this, and what are the results? And as you see on the ground there in LA, there may not be immediate activities going on, but at least the president's view is, and again, rightly or wrongly, he could be wrong about it, but his view is that even the deployment of the National Guard did not get the situation under sufficient control, and as a result, he's now decided to deploy these 700 Marines.
But he decided to send the National Guard before there was any trouble on the streets, before there was any violence.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, look, I think the president obviously made the determination that he anticipated there might be violence, and it turns out he was right. I mean, look what we saw happen in LA.
Did that not antagonise the situation? This is what Newsom is saying. Look, you've got people in LA who are exercising their First Amendment rights. Rioting is wrong. Everybody can agree with that. But it was very peaceful. It was peaceful, and people were angry and they were shouting at ICE, and they had ICE pinned down at one point. But they certainly weren't doing anything else up until that point. And what else are these people meant to do when they're seeing their neighbourhoods being torn apart and these immigrants being removed? Not criminals, mind you, and Trump is still saying they're all criminals. These were hardworking immigrants. People have the right under the First Amendment to do that.
Well, let's talk about a few things there, Petrie. I think there's a lot to say there. Number one, whether the protests were peaceful or not at the time, right? The idea that simply because the president or anybody, if the governor decided to do it, decides to deploy armed, police officers or riot police or the military, the National Guard, or the like, that doesn't justify, as you know, the decision to engage in the kind of behavior that we saw in Los Angeles.
There's no,
and so
okay.
But this argument that I think has been said a lot in the last couple of days that, the president provoked the situation and caused the violence that took place. There's no basis for saying that, right? Other than the president made a determination and then people engaged in violence, right? The violence is not a justifiable response to the National Guard being deployed. Just like it wouldn't be an appropriate response to the police being deployed or police in riot gear being deployed. And so I think that's sort of precept number one. Precept number two, I think it's fair to say that the president is acting. Look, I don't agree with the president on a lot of things, right? The president actually is saying that the people that have been removed by ICE are violating federal law because they're present in the United States unlawfully. Does that justify grabbing them off the streets and throwing them in cells and treating them inappropriately? Of course not. But are they a violation of federal law? Absolutely. Are they criminals? Yes. Are they violent criminals? Have they engaged in other crimes beyond being illegally present? Some of them may have. We don't know for sure.
Hang on, Jamil. You say, are they criminals? Yes. And many of these people are trying to get their paperwork in order, and they're being arrested at court. Is that a criminal who's trying to do the right thing, trying to get their paperwork sorted out, going through the process, and they're being arrested in the courthouse? I don't see the link between that being a criminal.
Well, Petrie, it's very simple. It's very straightforward, right? It is not lawful, and it is a crime to be present in a country, whether it's the United States or France or the UK. It is a crime to be present in a country without lawful papers. Now,
but they're trying to get
your papers in order.
Yeah, they're trying to get those lawful papers.
That's not how it works. But that's not how the process works.
But isn't that how asylum works? Isn't that how everybody going to any country gets?
That is not. No, absolutely not. If I enter the UK, right? If I wasn't a U.S. citizen, I can come there without a visa because I'm a U.S. citizen. But if I want to enter the UK and I want to remain in the UK, I have to apply before I arrive for an immigrant visa. If I'm granted one, then I can enter. I am not allowed to simply cross the border into the UK, into France, into the EU, into the United States without lawful papers. If I choose to do that, then at the border, I can choose to claim asylum and say to a border officer, I am seeking asylum in the United States, and then they will process me and either grant me temporary asylee status, at which point I'm lawfully in the country on a temporary basis, and then I can litigate it, right? But if the border officer doesn't grant me asylee status, or I sneak in, and then I want to claim asylum in court, I am not present lawfully. That is true in the UK. That is true in the EU. That is true in the United States. That is true in every country in the world. There's no country where you can enter that country unlawfully and you're present there and it's not a crime. Now, some countries may enforce it. Some countries may not. A lot of these people, you're right, are coming to the United States to work in jobs that other people may not want, jobs that other people may not be willing to accept the wage for. We know for a fact in the United States that illegal immigrants and legal immigrants are critical to our national economy, right? That being said, it doesn't change the fact that when you enter the country without lawful papers, you are committing a federal crime, and you are both prosecutable and you are removable immediately. Now, there's a process by which the government lets you go through, which is to say, I am here lawfully, I deserve asylum, I can't be removed immediately.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a lot of things, and these people are. I'm not saying that these people are criminals in any sense of the word, other than having committed the crime of being present unlawfully. The president, of course, is making allusions that suggested something more. But at a minimum, it is not inappropriate or illegal for the United States to take somebody who's present unlawfully in the country, detain them, and seek to remove them. That is a normal process that every country in the world has the authority to do.
With due,
how they do
with
it,
due process.
and how they handle it. And that due process is when you're picked up, you have a chance to argue to a judge that you are not present here lawfully. As a general matter in immigration proceedings, that's an executive branch official.
But that hasn't been happening, has it? Due process hasn't been followed.
We have certainly seen problems with that. We've seen these removal of a number of what the president says are violent gang members without due process. That's gone all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court has said, no, you must give these people the right to challenge their detention in court, because just because you say so, it doesn't mean they are here illegally. Exactly. It doesn't mean they qualify under the orders. But everyone agrees that if a court determines that they are what you say they are, then they are removable. And so the president has to allow the process to take place. And we've seen problems with that, and we've seen the court all the way to the Supreme Court 9-0 decision. Take that back. But what you're seeing in LA right now, in terms of what ICE is doing, it's obviously very concerning. The governor of California, the mayor of LA is very concerned. They're concerned about the communities there. And the way they're handling themselves may not be something that we would like to see, or that you might not like, I might not like. Is it unlawful? That's a different question.
It's in a sanctuary city, right, isn't it? Just before I let you go, Steve Bannon is calling for the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, to be arrested for interfering with federal authorities. And front page of one of our newspapers today saying that Trump wants Newsom arrested. Yeah.
Well, we heard Tom Homan, the border czar, yesterday say that if Gavin Newsom gets in the way, he said that he wouldn't hesitate to arrest him. Well, we saw Gavin Newsom on TV yesterday say pretty straightforwardly, bring it. And he said to Tom Homan, you should come on down and arrest me. So that issue is now teed up. We'll see if, in fact, the president or his team decides to arrest either the mayor or the governor. It would be unprecedented, I think, for a public official in the course of their duties to be arrested. But at the same time, it is when federal law is being violated, those who obstruct the execution of federal law can be arrested. It is a federal crime. And while we may not agree with it, you or I or anybody else on a policy level may not agree, think to yourself that this were a Southern governor in the 1950s during the Civil Rights Movement, and they stood in the doorway of a classroom that the Supreme Court ordered desegregated, in violation of federal law, could a president have ordered that person arrested? The answer is probably yes. Did they? They didn't. They simply escorted the students into those schools. Could they have? They probably could have. And could they do it here? They probably could. It will tee up a huge political fight, Petrie, and we'll see what happens after that. I think it's a fight probably that neither really wants, but both appear to be trying to pick it right now, and so we'll see how that plays out.
And finally, on those 700 Marines, has their level of force been agreed yet?
The question of when lethal force is used is a question set by the commander-in-chief and then the officials on the ground, the rules of engagement. Obviously, the president may have a different view of what the appropriate level of use of force is than others may. And certainly the levels of use of force may be different than what traditional law enforcement is used to. That's part of why you call out the National Guard and or the Marines. But this is a very dangerous and tense situation. The president will be wise to be very cautious here. I don't think anybody, not the president, not the governor, not the mayor, and certainly not the people of Los Angeles, wants to see American troops firing on anybody, any protesters, Americans or otherwise, or people here legally or illegally. That is not something that's going to do our nation a favor. It's not something that's going to do the president any favors.
But they could use, the Marines could be used to shoot on American citizens on American soil.
Well, look, I mean, it would obviously be hugely problematic and could violate all sorts of laws. You can't use the military in the United States to effectuate civilian law. There's a law against that. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act. That doesn't prevent the government from deploying the military to support otherwise lawful law enforcement efforts. It simply prohibits them from being used purely for law enforcement purposes. There's a fine line between those things. And the idea of the U.S. military firing on Americans is obviously anathema. We've seen it happen on occasion at Kent State. We've seen it at times during riot scenarios but they always try to use non-lethal force first, right? And that's the way it ought to be. That's the way law enforcement operates. That's the way the military ought to operate in these circumstances. The president, his borders are, anybody else that's influential in this process, Stephen Miller, should be very cautious. And they should make sure they set the lines of responsibility, the lines of authority, and the rules of engagement very clearly, and should err in favor of not using lethal force, except if there's a circumstance in which that would be interpreted, just like it would, by the way, for a law enforcement officer to use lethal force. Our law enforcement officers, our police.
It's very different to have the military shooting at civilians.
It is exactly. It's exactly right. Yeah. It's bad enough. You're
That's
exactly
a big
right.
move.
It's a big move, and it would be very dangerous, and I think actually destructive to the president's position. And I don't think it would gain him support. I think it would cause problems. I think he's probably aware of that. Whether he
That's
chooses
a terrifying
to,
statement, Jamil. He's probably aware of that.
Well, look, I think by all accounts, the current president chooses to do things differently than a lot of his predecessors in many, many ways, not just in this scenario, and those things are controversial and problematic at times. And so we'll see how he decides to handle the situation. But of course, the American people will judge him. The American political system will judge him. And the media is watching every minute of this, not just the American media, but the global media. And so we'll see how this plays out. But everyone will be wise in this scenario to tone things down, to be cautious. And I will say this, what we saw on the streets of Los Angeles over the last few days, it's my hometown, it's unacceptable. People, whatever protests you may have, whether you're concerned about what's happening on the streets or not, you cannot attack cars, destroy them, light them on fire. We've seen this in city after city after city across the country when people get heated. Police reacted also, not always appropriate, right? But what we don't want here is the kind of violence that we've seen in LA over the last few days on both sides of the aisle. But to be clear, when you're engaged in a peaceful protest, stopping cars, vandalizing them, and burning them is not acceptable.
I know, I couldn't agree with that more. I really couldn't. I just hope that these Marines remember the Constitution. Thank you very much indeed, Jamil. Jamil Jaffer there, talking to us live from the US, Executive Director at the National Security Institute at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Quick break, then back to the phone in just a moment.